Welcome to the Knowledge Seeker channel. The channel is dedicated to exploring critical issues in the world. As such, this channel is not afraid to challenge existing facts, beliefs, and practices in order to contribute to the advancement of knowledge. This presentation is titled The Social Media Approach to Igbo Unification, a Strategic Flaw. It unifies and divides at the same time. The purpose of this presentation is to accomplish three goals. One, to explore the Igbo unification campaign throughout Nigeria. Two, determine whether there are flaws in the use of social media as a tool to carry out the campaign. And three, identify the flaws and potential consequences of the method being used to unify the Igbo nation. In order to accomplish the goals of the presentation, the following arguments are made. 1. While the effort to unify the Igbos is laudable and highly welcomed, the use of social media as a tool to do so is flawed. 2. The unification effort is counterproductive to Igbo economic interest. 3. The effort is counterproductive to the campaign for the success of the United States of Biafra. 4. The social media methodology arouses countermeasures by other ethnic groups, thereby diminishing the strategic importance of the effort. And 5. It would have been more beneficial if the Ohanese had worked with the unification groups to establish committees that work behind the scenes to communicate with leaders of various Igbo subgroups to reinforce unity without putting pressure on people to say publicly whether they are Igbos or not through the social media. Well, this presentation is for educational purposes only. Thus, this presentation is not intended to attack or condemn the Igbo unification effort or incite anti-Igbo feelings, but to show the danger of using social media to carry out such a noble task. It suggests that the campaign would have been done diplomatically without the use of social media. Now, let's look at the introduction to the topic of discussion. It is a natural right for any political community or ethnic or religious or cultural group to plan, adopt ways, and implement them to reinforce its existence, not only in Nigeria but throughout the world. Therefore, the members of the Igbo ethnic nationality, like any other nationality in Nigeria, have inalienable rights to meet, discuss, and develop strategies to enhance their existence culturally, economically, and politically. In this regard, the Igbo unification movement has the natural right to organize and mobilize its members to unify the Igbo nationality, like other ethnic nationalities in Nigeria. In fact, the chaotic nature of Nigeria has necessitated Nigeria's ethnic and tribal groups to unify and reinforce their nationalities as a mechanism to ensure their survival as the country implodes politically and economically. Consequently, it was very timely for Igbo sons and daughters to establish the Igbo Cultural and Social Enlightenment for Unity Foundation, that is the NCSEUF, the Igbo Unification Movement, and the Igbo na Asu Bia. In particular, the purpose of the NCSEUF is, and I quote, to unite all Igbo-speaking people across Nigeria to enable them achieve a common goal, and I unquote. This is a gathering of participants in the NCSEUF meeting at Asaba. So here you have noble sons of Igbo land who gather at Asaba to plan, strategize, and carry out a campaign to unify the Igbos. This is a gathering of the members of Ohaneze, the major socio-cultural political organization in Igbo land. Now, let's look at the strategic flaws in using social media to campaign for unification. While it is noble and timely for Igbos to take the necessary steps to unify themselves, especially after the tumultuous civil war that caused so much bloodshed, suffering, and disarray, it is maintained here that the increasing use of the social media as a tool to do so is strategically disadvantageous to the Igbo nation. The method being used seems to arouse other groups to react in ways that are not beneficial to the Igbo nation. Please follow me as I point out the flaws of using social media to spread the campaign for the unification of Igbo land. 1. Social media advocates for Igbo unification tend to ignore the consequences and implications of their statements and actions. They rarely pay attention to the fact that their statements and actions have consequences. They rarely pay attention to the potential implications of their statements and actions. Therefore, the social media approach is generating animosities within Igbo land and with Igbo neighbors. 2. The Igbo nation is one of the three major ethnic groups in Nigeria. The Igbo nation is one of the most populous ethnic groups, not only in Nigeria but throughout Africa. In Nigeria, the Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba are the three largest or most populated ethnic groups. As a major ethnic group in the country, it is necessary for members of the Igbo nation to be tactful and reflective in engaging in a campaign that seems to polarize people within Igbo land and riling up people from other ethnic groups. As a major ethnic group in the southeast region of Nigeria, any statement or action made or taken by members of the Igbo nation is carefully scrutinized and reflected upon by members of minority groups in the region, the Yoruba, Fulani, and Hausa. Therefore, when fantastic ancestral, historical, and territorial claims are made through the social media as part of the campaign to unify Igbo nation without considering the feelings of Igbo neighbors, the neighbors take countermeasures and consciously try to distance themselves from the Igbos. The countermeasures being taken by other ethnic groups could end up diminishing the gains made through the unification effort. 3. Minority concerns about domination and absorption by the majority groups. Due to the huge population of the majority ethnic groups, minority groups are always concerned about being dominated and absorbed. This is why since the colonial period they have persistently worked to separate themselves politically from the majority groups. Hence, whenever Igbo individuals make controversial, ancestral, territorial, and historical statements on social media, minority groups in the South view such statements as a coded effort to dominate and colonize them. So, they tactically detach themselves from the Igbo nation. As a major ethnic group, it is strategically disadvantageous for members of the unification team to use social media to make fantastic statements that push minority groups in the South-South zone to move away from their major neighbor. It should be reminded that when the United Nations conducted a referendum for English-speaking Cameroon, Southern Cameroonians who were attached to the eastern region of Nigeria decided to join the Republic of Cameroon to avoid domination and marginalization, instead of remaining in Nigeria, while Northern Cameroonians voted to remain in Nigeria instead of joining Cameroon as their Southern brothers and sisters did on October 1, 1961. The Southern Cameroonians complained of severe marginalization and domination as a reason for opting to join the Republic of Cameroon. 4. The use of social media to campaign for Igbo unification unites as well as divides Igbo groups. Thus, the increasing use of social media to propagate Igbo unification seems disadvantageous in achieving the strategic goal due to the animosity it generates within Igbo land and with other ethnic groups. And there are many instances and examples to cite from. A. Social media advocates of unification tend to create unnecessary tension among the Igbos and members of other ethnic groups. B. They tend to make statements that capture public attention with controversial titles that arouse negative emotional responses. C. Most times, they only quote experts or scholars who reinforce their points of view and ignore other scholarly perspectives. D. In particular, they like to visit communities and force people to speak publicly on camera to determine their ethnic status. Quite often, the interviewees feel cornered and forced to respond in ways that support the view of the interviewers. It is easy to detect psychological distress on the faces and body language of many traditional leaders and youths who are compelled to speak publicly on camera about their Igbo status. F. Social media advocates tend to make statements claiming Igboship of many communities that have both Igbo and non-Igbo ancestry. G. The social media approach is creating disunity in Anioma. The reason is that while majority of the people are Igbos, there are subgroups which have assimilated into Igbo culture but have Bini, Igala, and possibly Esan origins. This is why, while some people want Anioma to become a state and be part of the Southeast zone, there are those who do not want to join the Southeast zone. H. Agbo people claim to represent the entirety of Ika people, while some Ika people discount the Agbo claim. I. Some Agbo and other Ika people claim Benin ancestry, while others claim Igbo ancestry. Here, the aggressive social media tactics remind minority groups of the pre-Civil War effort to compel them to accept Biafra. It also reminds many members of the minority groups about the forceful ways of the NCNC during the First Republic. It was the forcefulness that compelled many Efiks and Ibibios to identify with the action group, that is, the AG party, against the NCNC. The tribalized way Professor Eyoita was removed as the head of government in eastern Nigeria compelled many minority groups to seek the creation of Calabar Ugoja River State in 1953, even before certain Cameroonians decided to leave the region. Five, the proactive unification effort on social media threatens Igbo economic interests nationally. The nationalistic tone in the unification effort by social media advocates seems to run counter to the economic interests of the Igbo nation in Nigeria. Why? The Igbos are major traders and manufacturers in Nigeria. Their major economic occupations require them to establish markets in other parts of Nigeria. This is why Igbos can be found throughout Nigeria, since they engage in buying and selling of goods and services. The need to migrate and create new market opportunities is negated by the nationalistic drive through the social media to unify the Igbo nation. In other words, the more the Igbo unification effort is ideologically driven, the more other ethnic groups too become ideologically driven to protect their territories from the Igbos. They do so by adopting tactics that discourage Igbo entrepreneurs from coming to their territories to settle and trade. There are many instances to cite from to show the trend, but a few will do here. A. When Northerners, especially the Fulanis and Hausas, felt that their presence in the southeast was no longer tolerated, the youths of the region ordered the Igbos to vacate the north. In the Kaduna Declaration, a coalition of northern youths ordered the Igbos to vacate the north in June 2017. The Northern Elders Forum supported the northern youths. B. The Yorubas too are increasingly becoming nationalistic and ordering the Igbos to vacate Yoruba land. C. In Lagos, the tactical demolition of markets patronized by Igbos is not by accident. They are basically wanting the Igbos to go back to their region. D. The minorities in the South are watching, calculating, and developing countermeasures to protect their lands and interests. E. Some prominent individuals are even suggesting that no land should be sold to any Igbo person to avoid future land crisis. F. In some parts of Nigeria, some landlords are increasingly hesitant to allow Igbos to rent their residential properties. G. Many members of the South-South zone are reminded of the past where they had to adopt various tactics to avoid being dominated and assimilated. Thus, the more social media advocates of unification make controversial statements about other groups, those groups are going to tactically discourage Igbo settlements in their territories. It is necessary to be careful. 6. The proactive social media effort to unify the Igbo negates the Biafran effort. Most Biafrans tend to equate Biafra with Igbo land and vice versa. Yet, the Biafra map reflects a multi-ethnic state, hence the name, the United States of Biafra. Thus, the United States of Biafra embraces other ethnic groups. Unfortunately, the nationalistic fervor to unify Igbo land negates the Biafran effort to unify the Igbos and other South-South groups in Biafra. It is strategically unwise to make controversial statements and take actions that threaten minority groups and then expect them to join you to form Biafra. Do not forget the reason which prompted Southern Cameroonians to leave Eastern region to join the Republic of Cameroon. Any Biafran who thinks that the Benis, Efiks, Ejaham, Ibibios, Andonis, Ogonis, Ijos, Isokos, Ishikris, and Urobos will join you to establish Biafra when they are keenly aware of the Igboization campaign must be playing. In other words, since the Igbo nation is one of the three major ethnic groups in Nigeria, any campaign toward Igboization is considered a serious threat to the minority groups. Therefore, the Unification campaign is certainly driving other ethnic groups to develop their own strategic plans. Thus, the Unification agenda and the Biafran agenda are incompatible. This is a group of demonstrators for Biafra. So, as you can see, the Biafrans are campaigning vigorously for the attainment of the Republic of Biafra. Yet, on the other hand, you have this Igbo unification campaign that tends to destroy this Biafran effort. 7. The unification campaign on social media threatens Igbo desire for a national policy on state of residence, that is, the policy of indigenization. The nationalistic fervor of the Igbo unification campaign on social media might end up killing any effort to encourage other ethnic groups to accept the state of residence policy in Nigeria. The reason is that the expansive territorial claims might be viewed by some ethnic groups as an effort to claim their lands, thereby compelling them to reject any attempt to institute a national policy on state of residence. It should be noted that the Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives, Honorable Benjamin Okezie Kalu, who submitted an indigenization bill in the National Assembly, later withdrew the bill due to strong opposition. Now, it is not likely for other ethnic groups to accept a state of residence policy, considering the nationalistic tone of the unification campaign. 8. The major tendency to oversimplify ethnic, cultural, ancestral, and historical ties in social media. A major disadvantage of the social media approach in carrying out the campaign to unify Igbo nation is the oversimplification of complex interethnic, cultural, historical, and ancestral ties among the Igbos and other ethnic groups. It should be noted that due to centuries of interaction through interethnic marriages and trade, there is extensive interethnic, cultural, and ancestral ties in Nigeria. There are many instances to cite from. A. The Ijos have considerable relationships with the Igbos on both the eastern and western flanks of Ijoland and vice versa. The Ogba Igbema, Ndoke, Abo, Umoru, and other Oru Igbos, especially Ukwane people, have relationship with the Ijos. This is why the Ijo marry extensively in Abo and other Ukwane areas. This is also why the Okrika, Andoni, Kalabare, Boni, and Opopo intermarry with Igbos extensively. The Ijos also have interethnic relationships with the Bibio, Ikwere, Ogoni, Isoko, Ishikri, Urobo, and Yoruba, and vice versa. Therefore, just as there are Ijos with Igbo blood, there are also Igbos with Ijo blood. So when Igbo unification advocates scream on social media, this is Igbo, that is Igbo, it oversimplifies complex ancestral and cultural connections. B. The Arochukwu and Abriba people have extensive relationships with the Anang, Ibibio, Efik, and Ejagham people. This is why these groups gather annually to celebrate the Ekpe festival. They have extensive ancestral and cultural ties. C. The Igbanke people have Igbo, Benin, Igala, and possibly Asian ties. So when Igbo unification advocates screamed, "This is Igbo, that is Igbo," it creates tension and psychological trauma for groups that have mixed ancestral ties. D. The Igbos have relationships with Igala, Benin, Ibibio, Urobo, Isoko, and Idoma in Benue State. Quite often, those social media advocates for Igbo unification ignore the interethnic mixture and create the impression that the Igbos have no relationship with other ethnic groups, hence the uncompromising adoption of Igbo nationalism. E. The uncompromising approach to Igbo identity is causing tension in Anioma, where many individuals have mixed ancestral connections, even though majority of the population is Igbo. 9. The propagandistic selection of historical and cultural information to reinforce ideological position. Many social media advocates of Igbo unification campaign tend to be propagandistic in the sense that they often pick or select the only historical points that reinforce the ideological view of Igbo-ness and ignore other theoretical possibilities or sources of a historical origin. The approach leads to oversimplification of complex ethnic, cultural, and ancestral relationships. By so doing, they mislead their supporters to take positions that are not grounded in reality. Thus, they play on the emotions of their supporters. 10. The Igbo unification campaign breeds a reaction by some Igbos to find their non-Igbo ancestry. As the advocates of Igbo unification saturate the social media space with their stories, it is forcing some Igbos to seek their ancestral roots. And there are many instances to cite from, but a few will do here. A. The Igbo unification campaign has compelled some Igbo-speaking Igala people of Ogurugu, Uzo, Uwani, and Ete people in Enugu State to begin to trace their Igala ancestry. B. The Olum Banasa communities of Nzam and Inoma in West Anambra local government area too are re-establishing their link with Igala, even though they are steeped in Igbo language and culture. C. Due to the social media pressure to identify as Igbo, some people in Anioma have openly declared that they have Igala and Benin ancestry, even though the majority of the population is Igbo. For instance, the Obi of Umunede, His Royal Majesty Dr. Ezeagu Ezenwale I, has declared openly that his people have Benin ancestry, even though they have assimilated to the Igbo culture and now speak Igbo and bear Igbo names. D. The Obi of Agbo, His Royal Highness Benjamin Kiagbore Kuzu Ikechukwu, declared that his people originated from Benin. The Benin origin has been challenged by those who insist on Igbo origin. E. The Asaba of Asaba, Professor Epiphany Azinge, declared that his people have Igala ancestry, even though they have thoroughly assimilated to Igbo culture and speak Igbo. He explained, and I quote, "It is a distortion of history. The correct historical proposition is that when he was born, the acclamation was Kai Nebisi Male Ife Nwa Ga Abu," literally meaning, let's watch and see what this child will be. And to that extent, it is Kai Nebisi. The father of our founding father was undoubtedly from Igala, and his mother hailed from Inteje. His mother was not from Asaba, so she could not have been our progenitor. But his father was, and to that extent we are traceable to him. So we are here today to pay homage to our founding father, and I unquote. Thus, he said the name is Kainebisi and not Nebisi. 11. The Ikwere nationality. Social media advocates of Igbo unification rarely pay attention to the ethnographic, historical, and political facts. They believe that Ikwere people changed their identity due to the Nigerian Civil War. However, the Ikwere nation has persistently maintained that it is a distinct nationality separate from the Igbo. And there are many ways they have demonstrated their distinctiveness. A. Ikwere agitation for recognition as a distinct indigenous ethnic group started before independence, not after the Civil War. B. Ikwere leaders maintained that their name, Iwurona, was Igbonized to Ikwere because an Igbo translator working with the British in Port Harcourt did so. C. The Ikwere nationality is recognized by the Nigerian Constitution of 1979 as a distinct indigenous nationality, just like the Igbo or Ijo or Ogoni or Yoruba and so forth. D. A preamble explaining Ikwere origin was signed by prominent members of the Ikwere nation to testify to Ikwere distinctiveness. The Ikwere nation is made up of 4 local government areas, as reflected by the 4 clans of the nationality. In other words, there are 4 sub-ethnic groups in Ikwere land. F. The Ikwere nation has a population of 1.5 million people. G. Ikwere people, like other minority ethnic groups, attended the Henry Willings Commission hearings in 1957-1958, whereby they expressed their distinctiveness and fear of domination. Thus, there were some of the minority groups that demanded the creation of states to ensure their existence. H. They held demonstrations in Diobu, Port Harcourt, to protest against being declassified as Igbo on August 27, 1958. I. In the Rumomasi Declaration of 1965, they insisted that they are a distinct ethnic nationality. J. Prior to the Civil War, the Ikwere joined other minority groups to persuade Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon to declare states in Nigeria and to make Port Harcourt the capital of Rivers State. Okay? When they felt being marginalized in Rivers State, they joined the Ogba Egbema and the Ogoni people to demand the creation of Port Harcourt State in the 1970s and thereafter. Earl, during the Chukwu the Oputa Commission's Human Rights Violation Panel in 2001, the Ikwere declared that, and I quote, Ikwere ethnic nationality is not and has never been a subgroup of any other tribe in Nigeria, including Ndi Igbo, and I unquote, this means that the Ikwere nation is a distinct indigenous ethnic group that originated from Benin Nation in the past. To show their distinctiveness, Ikwere traditional rulers distanced themselves from the Igbo Ohaneze to make it clear to the world that they are not of Igbo nationality. They dismissed the effort to link them with the Igbo nation as, and I quote, ill-conceived, and attributing such narratives to historical oppression and suppression by Igbo merchants from Aro, Nkwere, and Oka, and I unquote. 12. Social media advocates tend to ignore a sociological phenomenon known as cultural assimilation. Cultural assimilation takes place when a minority group adopts the customs, language, values, and behaviors of a dominant or majority group, thereby losing its original language and culture. Assimilation can take place voluntarily through intermarriage and trade, or forcefully through conquest and colonization. Sometimes it is done through education and religion. Again, there are many instances or examples to cite from to show how some ethnic groups are absorbed and or assimilated by other groups. A. The English people started as members of the Celtic and Belgic nation, comprising of the Otrobets, Katuvalant, and Trinovant tribes. So they were made of 3 major tribes that make up the original English people. B. The Roman Empire conquered and colonized them in 43 CE. C. The Romans refer to the area as Britain. They named the place after Roman goddess Britannia. So today we refer to that part of the world as Britain. Britain. That name came from the Romans. D. The Anglo-Saxons, a Germanic tribe, arrived and settled in Britain. The English language is a product of the Anglo-Saxon language of the German nation. So you see how now the original Britons are now using English, which comes from a German tribe. E. The English conquered the Welsh, Scots, and Irish to spread English language. So the Irish people paid dearly for the English conquest and colonization of their land. These three ethnic groups spoke English and ignored their indigenous languages for a long time. But now they are reintroducing their languages as they become more nationalistic. So if you go to Ireland today, they are actually beginning to teach their indigenous language to their youths. The Welsh are doing the same thing and the Scots are doing the same thing. Apart from the English language that was imposed on them. F. Britain conquered and colonized Nigeria. The name Nigeria is a British creation. Today, all institutions of government in Nigeria are based on British institutions, even though Nigerians are not British. G. The French were known as Gauls before and during the Roman era. The Romans, under Julius Caesar, conquered and colonized Gaul in 58-51 BCE. H. Around 5 AD or 5 CE, Germanic people known as the Franks conquer and colonize the Gauls. I. King Clovis of the Franks unified the Gauls under one political system. Thus, France is named after the Germanic Franks who conquered the Gauls. So today when you hear France, you hear the French. That word comes from a German tribe and not from the original Gauls. You see? J. Increasingly, Apoy Ijo of Ondo State is being assimilated by Yoruba culture. K. Some Andoni Obolo people bear Ibibio names. Therefore, throughout history, smaller and less powerful groups have been conquered and assimilated by much powerful and larger groups. This is why minority groups in Nigeria demanded the creation of states going back to the colonial period to avoid being dominated and absorbed. It is a matter of survival and not hatred for the majority groups. 13. Social media campaigners tend to negate the effort to have Igbo president in Nigeria. The agitative social media unification effort could end up scaring members of other ethnic groups, especially the minorities and the Yorubas, from voting for an Igbo presidential candidate. Why? Because in a democratic political system, a presidential candidate must be able to gather votes from different parts of the country during election to win. However, if many groups perceive Igbo nationalism as a threat to their existence, they might end up voting for other candidates, thereby making it difficult for an Igbo presidential candidate to succeed. The social media campaign threatens the possibility of an Igbo president of Nigeria. 14. Social media advocates tend to reinforce the fear of Igbo agenda to dominate Nigeria. It should not be forgotten that during the colonial era, there were allegations made that the Igbos, through the Igbo Federal Union and the Igbo State Union, developed a strategic plan to dominate Nigeria. Although this allegation has been flatly denied by the Igbo nation, nevertheless, there are still strong feelings about the issue. Therefore, when Igbo social media exponents continue to make historical and ancestral claims that threaten other ethnic groups, those groups are likely to react by distancing themselves from the Igbos to avoid being absorbed. 15. The social media approach counteracts the desire for a seaport in the Southeast zone. As a major ethnic group in Nigeria, when some of its members actively promote Igbo nationalism by expansively defining Igbo territory, minority groups react by distancing themselves from the Igbo nation and forming alliances with other regions. Under the circumstances, it is doubtful if they will ever cooperate to enable the dredging of their lands to enable ships to get to the southeast. Thus, each time Igbo territory is expansively defined by social media advocates of Igbo unification, the more the other ethnic groups watch their territories like hawks to avoid being surprised. 16. Social media exponents of Igbo unification do not tolerate alternative views. The nationalistic fervor for unification leads to a situation whereby alternative views are not tolerated by many social media advocates. Thus, any Igbo who claims to have a different ancestry is viewed as a traitor and openly castigated for opposing the ideologically propounded view of Igbo ancestry. This creates intra-ethnic division and inter-ethnic Cold War between the Igbo and its neighbors. When freedom of expression is restricted through intimidation, it polarizes the Igbo nation. Thus, it takes courage for Ikwere traditional leaders and the Obi of Umunede to claim that they have Benin ancestry, and the Asagba of Asaba to infer that his people are of Igala ancestry. The unification campaign drives a wedge between community members who have contrary views about their ancestry. The uncompromising trend resembles the campaign for Biafran secession in 1967, before and during the Civil War. It should be recalled that even before the declaration of Biafran secession on May 30, 1967, the atmosphere in eastern Nigeria was very tense as the advocates for Biafra became intolerant of any alternative view about the matter. They mounted demonstrations throughout the major cities in eastern Nigeria and made sure that an alternative viewpoint was not tolerated. Hence, many people, both Igbos and non-Igbos, were detained for being regarded as saboteurs for expressing contrary views about the secession. To avoid being arrested, millions of people kept quiet and spoke less as the Biafrans dominated political discourse in the region. As a result of the tension, minority groups in Eastern region could not openly express their opposition to secession. Today, those who have alternative views about their ancestry are being abused, castigated, and threatened by social media advocates for Igbo unity, just like the period before the Civil War. It is frightening. This is why Anyoma is polarized and very tense. 17. Just like before the Civil War, threats are being issued against those who claim other ancestry. Some advocates of Igbo unification have threatened to deal with those who do not identify with Igbo nationality. According to Dr. Oka Chikwu Dibia, the president of the Iwu Ruana Progressive Organization, some individuals associated with the Igbo unification movement threatened the Ikwere nation by warning, and I quote, "Ikwere land is the Igbo tongue to the sea, and any attempt to excise it out of Igbo land will be resisted with the sword," and I unquote. It is obvious that the unity campaign is taking a path similar to the threatening atmosphere before the civil war in eastern Nigeria. Many leaders of the minority groups fled eastern Nigeria and Biafra to avoid being arrested and detained for not supporting Biafra. Thus, as the Igbo unification campaign takes on an uncompromising ideological orientation on social media, the minorities in the South-South are watching the situation carefully so that the past does not repeat itself again. The trend is going to push minority groups in the South-South to develop countermeasures, just like they did prior and during the Civil War. 18. The social media methodology encourages rivalry among content creators, thereby polarizing the campaign. While social media is effective in capturing the attention of the public, it generates unnecessary competition and the desire to dominate the unification campaign by content creators. To attract public attention and increase audience, content creators create flashy and controversial titles and make historical claims that are incredulous. The more they try to capture public attention, the more they incite their audiences with fantastic stories that do not reflect the facts on the ground. Thus, they are polarizing the political and social environment in Igbo land as well as in southern Nigeria. Conclusion. There is no doubt that the campaign to unify Igbo nation is the right and proper thing to do, considering the bitter experiences of the Nigerian Civil War and the political marginalization that have taken place in Nigeria after the war. However, the excessive reliance on social media to carry out the campaign is a strategic flaw, thereby dampening the overall goal of the unification. 1. The social media methodology is flawed and counterproductive. 2. It is counterproductive to Igbo economic interest. 3. It is counterproductive to the campaign for the success of the United States of Biafra. 4. It is counterproductive to the campaign to have an Igbo president of Nigeria. 5. It is counterproductive to the desire to have a seaport in the southeast because it might generate strong opposition by the minority groups to have their lands dredged to make way for ships to go through. 6. The vigorous use of the social media arouses countermeasures by other ethnic groups, thereby pulling them away from the Igbo nation to avoid being dominated and assimilated. 7. Thus, as an increasing number of Igbo subgroups identify with the Igbo nation, there are also subgroups that are pulling away from the Igbo nation. It leads to oversimplification of ethnic, cultural, and ancestral relationships. It leads to historical claims that are very controversial, thereby arousing unnecessary political, cultural, and psychological tension among Igbo and non-Igbos. The more the Igbo social media advocates are strident in their pursuit of their goals, the more other ethnic groups too become nationalistic in defense of their interests. Instead of the social media approach, the following would have been more beneficial in terms of strategic thinking. 1. After the Igbo Cultural and Social Enlightenment for Unity Foundation, Igbo Unification Movement, and the Ndi na Asubia met and strategized, they would have contacted the Ohanese. 2. Working with Ohanese, the groups would have established committees made up of selected elders and youths. 3. These committees would have been sent quietly to meet with the elders and youth leaders of various Igbo subgroups and discuss ways of unifying the ethnic group without cameras and public limelight to harmonize ideas. There would have been no publicity at all, as the committees consult with various communities. This would have allowed traditional and community leaders to discuss freely without being forced to appear on camera to say whether they are Igbo or not Igbo. Extensive notes would have been taken after each quiet meeting with various community leaders. Pictures would have only been taken after differences might have been thoroughly ironed out to show unanimity or a general agreement. This is the way diplomats and foreign states negotiate behind the limelight. A comprehensive report would have been compiled and submitted to the Ohanese. The Ohanese would have used the report as a policy tool to engage with various subgroups and finalize the unification exercise without fantastic video titles, incredulous historical claims, and in your face and we do not care about how you feel approach that rise up various subgroups and other nationalities on social media. Unfortunately, the practice of individual content creators roaming over the place and speaking to various traditional leaders and youth groups without a coordinated plan by Ohanese in public is leading to unnecessary tension and factionalization of many Igbo communities. Indeed, the social media approach counteracts Igbo strategic interests and arouses other ethnic groups to adopt countermeasures. Thank you for listening to this presentation. It is long, but it's worth it. Again, please subscribe to the channel and listen to other interesting presentations. on the Knowledge Seeker channel. Once again, thank you very much. Do not fail to subscribe to the channel. Again, thank you so much for listening to this presentation.